Hi everyone, my name is Herkeph and welcome back to my incredibly stupid hardcore world, where I am only allowed to use wooden tools and leather armor. As some of you may know, I died in my last hardcore world, but not only did I died in an incredibly unsatisfying and anticlimactic way, and in my last world, I had a bunch of farms that produced some very useful items for me whilst I could sit on my fat behind, doing absolutely nothing. However, this is a luxury that I no longer have, so in today's episode, I will be building what I think are some of the most important farms so that I may once again start lazing around like an absolute degenerate. So we're starting off by exploring for a bit in hopes of finding a pillager outpost so that we can get started building a raid farm. The reason we're starting off with a raid farm is because I will most likely end up dying quite soon if I don't get my hands on some totems of undying. The raid farm that I will be building is required to be built in a deep ocean. So ideally, we want to find a pillager outpost that is somewhat close to a deep ocean. That way we won't have to fly for too long when we want to use it. And after a couple minutes of flying, I spotted my first pillager outpost of this world. However, this one wasn't close to an ocean, which was rather disappointing. And just to make things even worse, the pillager outpost did not have any scarecrows, meaning I couldn't even steal any carved pumpkins. Nonetheless, I still decided to fly in to grab myself a goat horn, but overall, this pillager outpost was rather bad. I'd rate it a solid 2 out of 10. So I decided to keep looking for a pillager outpost that wasn't as shit as this one. And whilst I kept exploring, I came across a village that had some of the weirdest terrain I've ever seen, as there was a house that was randomly plonked on top of a random hill in the middle of the village. So I reacted in the only reasonable way and kicked down the door and threw the civilian out of his bed before heading out to continue our adventure. And after a bit more exploring, I managed to find myself yet another pillager outpost. And this one actually had scarecrows, which briefly restored my will to live. And after having looted the pillager outpost, I discovered that there was an ocean rather close to it, which meant that we had found the location to build our raid farm. So I flew back home and started making some preparations for the farm. However, in order to actually use the raid farm, I'm going to need a sword with sweeping edge. The reason we need that is because there's a chance that the evokers don't die from my attacks otherwise, meaning they will spawn in a bunch of vexes, which would mean a very quick death for me. So I decided to expand our villager trading setup in order to get sweeping edge, as well as a few other enchantments. And whilst we were waiting for our zombified villagers to convert back into normal villagers, I decided that it might be a good idea to actually label our villagers that we already had set up. I then got to the incredibly fun and engaging task of placing and breaking lecterns over and over again until they give me a trade I want. But eventually, I managed to get all of the enchantments that I was after. Now all I had to do was to collect all of the materials that I am going to need to actually construct the farm. I then started flying all the way back towards the pillager outpost that we had found earlier and kidnapped a villager on my way, which was the last thing that we needed in order to build the raid farm. And once we had made it all the way back to the ocean near the pillager outpost we found earlier, I started constructing the raid farm. And now that we have infinite access to golden babies and emeralds, I decided to start preparing for the next farm that we're going to build. So I brutally slaughtered a turtle and fed his crusty remains to some other turtles to then take their babies away from them. When doing stuff like this, I always get joy out of remembering that this is a game made for literal children. I then spent some time killing some creepers, as we still don't have a farm to get gunpowder. And once I had made some preparations, I dove into the nether to collect some magma. And as most of you have already guessed, yes, the next farm we're going to build is a gold farm. The reason we need a gold farm is quite straightforward. I'm going to need a bartering farm to actually get a viable source of obsidian. And we also get a bunch of blocks that we can use for building, which is a rather nice bonus. So once I had collected all of the materials that we would need for the gold farm, I made my way to the nether roof and relinked a new portal to my starter base. And once the portal had successfully been linked, I started looking for a nether wastes biome, which was rather easy to find. And building the gold farm without swift sneak was just as fun as one may imagine. This is probably one of my least favorite farms to build, simply because it has to be built whilst crouching, which is rather soul-crushing. But after an incredibly long time, I finally finished the gold farm and got it up and running, meaning I could now get started on the AFK area. And this is where I was going to enslave a couple piglins to use for my bartering farm. So I built up a temporary spawning platform to hopefully get some piglins to spawn. And after a very long time of waiting, we finally managed to get 2 piglins to spawn, meaning the bartering farm was pretty much done. So I put in some finishing touches and went to FK to let the farm work its magic, and now that we have a stable production of obsidian, we can go ahead and get started with our next farm, which will be a shulker farm. The reason we're building a shulker farm is because I am incredibly lazy and can't be bothered to go end raiding for hours on end, and we're actually going to need quite many shulker boxes, as we're going to want to build a mega base relatively soon, meaning we're going to need to transport a lot of materials. However, in order to build the shulker farm that I have in mind, we're going to need a bunch of carved pumpkins to make snow golems. So I spent some time looking for pillager outposts in hopes of snagging some from their scarecrows. But before getting started with the next farm, I decided that it would be a good idea to link our end portal to the nether roof so that we can have quick access to the end going forward. I then got on to the preparations for our next farm. So I crafted a bunch of rails as well as powered rails, which we're going to need to transport our future kidnapping victim, which will come in the form of a shulker. So I made my way to the end and started placing down all the rails as well as a bunch of buttons to prevent my kidnapping victim from running away in the wrong direction. And once all of the rails and buttons had been placed, I made my way to the end gateway and started my search for an end city that is close to an end gateway. But after a few minutes of exploring, I came across the worst end city generation that I have ever seen. The end city did have a boat, but the part of the boat where you get the elytra simply didn't generate. I then thanked God that I didn't run into this end city as my first one, and after a bit more exploring, I finally ran into not 1, not 2, but 3 end cities that were rather close to an end gateway. So I decided to steal the wings simply because I could, and got onto the task of kidnapping a couple shulkers and shoving them into the end gateway. However, once I made it back to the main end island, I realized that I had forgotten to place buttons in some spots, which made my life significantly harder than it had to be. I then went on to try to fix my silly little mistake and realized that I may as well kill one of the shulkers, as it will make my life even harder trying to salvage both of the shulkers I had stolen. However, after a bit of trying to fix the shulker issue, I accidentally looked at a couple endermen, which made an already annoying situation even more annoying. And since I am very bad at this game, I ended up almost dying to said enderman twice. And after having retrieved the rogue shulker, I decided to go for attempt number 2 of getting the shulker into the overworld. However, since I have room temperature level IQ, I had forgotten to place even more buttons, which caused me to end up with the exact same issue as before. I then continued struggling, getting the shulker into the overworld for a bit more, but I simply wasn't smart enough to actually get it working, which makes sense since I haven't watched all of Rick and Morty yet. So I decided to fly off, once again, to kidnap a fresh batch of shulkers to get a bit of a fresh start. And finally, After what felt like forever, I did manage to get a Shulker to the overworld, but I think that is where I'll go ahead and leave it for this week. So there we have it, the third episode of my incredibly stupid hardcore world. I hope you've enjoyed it. Please leave a like and subscribe if you did, and I'll see you in the next one, where we will build a Shulker farm.